This first question says, why do oligopolies exist? Explain the characteristics of an oligopolist whose product you own or regularly purchase. What distinguishes oligopoly from monopolistic competition? So this is a pretty open-ended question. First, before we even touch on these questions that they're asking, let's answer the question, what is an oligopoly, right? So an oligopoly is a market structure that's kind of similar to a monopoly, but instead of having one single supplier that dominates the entire market and has 100% market share, you have several different companies or several different firms which split the overall market. It's still very, very concentrated in terms of market share. It's just not just one single firm. The next question that they're asking us is, why do oligopolies exist? And a lot of the times the reason that we see oligopolies exist is either high entry costs or something like economies of scale, right? Where there's just a really, really high initial cost to enter this market that prevents a lot of smaller firms from participating and taking away market share from larger firms. And so the existing firms have this advantage as being established in this industry, where they already have invested that upfront, made that upfront investment, and start to experience economies of scale, where as they grow larger and larger, their average cost is actually decreasing, and that's why oligopolies exist. The next question asks us to explain the characteristics of oligopolists whose products you own or regularly purchase. So I don't know about owning or regular purchase, but a common example of oligopolies include the automobile industry. So if you think about the number of car brands out there, you can probably name the big ones right off the top of your head. There's Honda, Toyota, then you have GM, Ford, Mercedes, Audi. You might feel like, well, that seems like more than a few companies, but the fact that you can name most of the car brands that dominate the market without really having to think very hard means that it's most likely an oligopolist industry. You can compare that to a different product which might not be an oligopoly, might be close to perfect competition, like the brand of corn that you buy or what farmer you buy your corn from. That you have no idea who the manufacturers are because there's so many and the products are so indistinguishable that you're really not trying to, you really don't have an idea who those producers are. So the last question they're asking is, what distinguishes oligopoly from monopolistic competition? So let's review what monopolistic competition is. We already talked about monopolies, which is where one producer dominates the entire market. Oligopolies, where a few producers dominate the entire market. Monopolistic competition is when there's a lot of producers in the market, and it's distinguished from perfect competition in that in monopolistic competition, the firms sell slightly distinguished products. So there's a possibility to distinguish yourself from other firms in the market. And so that's the main difference. You see the difference between oligopoly and monopolistic competition when we are talking about the oligopolies having high entry costs to their industry and experiencing drastic economies of scale, whereas monopolistic competition simply refers to the idea that producers have the ability to slightly differentiate their products from one another. Okay, so hopefully that covers all the bases for this question. We can take a look at what the previous tutor has said. So the previous tutor said that oligopolies exist for several reasons, the most common probably being economies of scale. If these are substantial as they are in the automobile industry, for example, only very large firms can produce at minimum average costs. This makes it virtually impossible for new firms to enter the industry. A small firm could not produce at minimum cost and would soon be competed out of the business. Yet to start at the required very large scale would take far more money than an unestablished firm is likely to be able to raise before proving it will be profitable. I just realized I didn't really explain why automobiles end up being oligopolies, only that they are. The reason that automobiles are a classic example of oligopolies is, again, there's a few companies that dominate the market, and the reason there's only a few companies is because if you want to get into the automobile manufacturing business, you need to spend a lot of capital on designing your own car. You have to spend a lot of capital on building a car factory, which is the most expensive part of operating an automobile manufacturing firm. So you have to invest millions of dollars into building these factories and then pump out enough output for that to be worth it. And so that upfront cost before you can experience any economies of scale is why the automobile industry is a good example of an oligopoly. Okay, the previous year also says other barriers to entry include ownership of patents by the oligopolists, and possibly massive advertising that gives would-be newcomers no chance to establish a presence in the public's mind. Finally, there is the urge to merge. Mergers have the clear advantage of reducing competition, of giving the emerging oligopolists more monopoly power. Also, they may result in more economies of scale and thereby increase that barrier to new entry. Oligopolies with which we deal with include manufacturers of automobiles, ovens, refrigerators, personal computers, gasoline, and courier systems. Services. An oligopoly is distinguished from monopolistic competition by being composed of few firms, not many, by being mutually interdependent with regard to price, by having differentiated or homogeneous products, and by having significant obstacles to entry, both engage in much non-price competition. So I think one thing that the previous year touches on that I think is also important to highlight is this idea of mutual interdependence with regard to price. Oligopolies are the primary market type you're going to deal with when you start learning about game theory, which is the idea that which is the study of like games in which one firm or one person's decisions are going to be dependent on the decision that another firm makes. So in an oligopoly, because there's only a few firms that make up the industry, pricing decisions or advertising decisions by one firm are going to be directly relevant to the pricing and advertising and production decisions of the other firms. And this is unlike in other markets where there's a lot of competition, because in a perfectly competitive market, one firm deciding to advertise more or to do it to some different pricing scheme has no impact on another firm's decision to do something similar. And that's a big distinguishing point. And if you guys get into game theory, like that's going to be something that you guys will definitely learn about. Good. I don't think there's anything wrong with this answer though. So great answer. We can move on.